Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Nyemade Boiwu. I am NAMI Delaware's Diversity and Equity Fellow. I'm so excited. We have a great guest with us today to talk about addiction and mental health. So I'm going to let Alicia go ahead and introduce herself, tell you a little bit about her.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I'm looking forward to this discussion. My name is Alicia Emmanuel. I am a licensed professional counselor. My specialties are in the addiction field, addiction and mental health. But in terms of behavioral health, I am excited to talk about what addiction is and to go further into that topic today.
Me too. Thank you again for joining us. And your role is the director of?
So I'm the Deputy Chief of Addiction Services in Delaware with the Division of Substance Abuse and Mental Health.
Nice. I mean, to get started, our whole subject is on addiction, but what is addiction? Like, how is it defined, especially in the clinical terms?
So in clinical sense, which I'll try not to go too far into it, right? So an addiction really is a chronic disease of the brain. So really a dysfunction that involves an individual seeking rewards, right? They're motivated typically by the drive or desire there's a craving that happens, right? A compulsive difficulty to control despite harmful consequences. So if I'm a person, and I'll just use something like cigarettes, right? So if I recognize that I'm addicted to smoking cigarettes, despite the fact that I have to get work done, despite my break being maybe 30 minutes, I may have that compulsive desire to constantly go out for cigarette breaks. And I'm really using something smaller because I'm sure we'll dive deeper into the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so that's a great explanation of it. I think that because there are so many things, like I always say that, I feel like we live in a time now where everybody's on something, right? Mm-hmm. Like coffee, cigarettes, like you mentioned, marijuana, especially now that that's legal, or alcohol. So it's like, are we all addicted, or are those just vices? And it sounds like from what you're saying, it really depends on how it impacts your day-to-day life.
Yes, it's the impact. It's the compulsive response that we have, right? So despite consequences in our lives, we still seek that desire to get whatever our, like, as you stated, our vice may be, right? Mm-hmm. And that causes harmful responses. However, despite those harmful responses, we still engage in that respective vice.
Are there any signs that someone can look out for that says, like, okay, this is going past this thing I love to do into, like, this is an addiction?
Yeah, so typically if it is impacting my life in such a harmful or challenging way, my ability to stop, my self-control now goes out the window, right? So let's say I'm supposed to go and, I don't know, have a girls' night or something like that. But I am so focused on, I've already been drinking, prior to going out. Maybe I have a DUI because I was drinking and driving, and maybe I'm on my second DUI or something like that, because the compulsive nature of it has now taken control, and I haven't had the opportunity to stop, or the opportunity to maybe even recognize how it's impacting my life until an unfortunate consequence sometimes is introduced. And that's not the case for everyone. Definitely it's not. And we can talk about other types of, drug addictions that fall into that category as well. So not just alcohol or marijuana.
Now, when I think that sometimes, I don't know from personal experience, just from observations, I think that sometimes it's hard for people to really gauge that they're at the addiction stage, because they may be like, okay, well, this is a vice, but if I can stop doing it for a day or so, then obviously I'm not addicted, so I can go right back to it. And I think it's easier when it's something you're like, oh, I can just cut out forever, to say whether you're addicted or not. But when there's certain things where you're like, well, I still want to have this in my life. If someone's able to say, like, okay, I can go a day or two without it, are they still in the addiction danger zone, or is it like, okay, you're good?
Not necessarily, right? So it's really looking at, what does that person's makeup look like, right? So what is their judgment, their stress level, their ability to make healthy decisions look like prior to that substance being introduced? Okay, so the person that maybe has struggles day to day with anxiety, the struggles with depression. But as they introduce a substance that maybe was meant to help them initially, now they're taking more than what was prescribed. So it's going beyond that limit, right? So the person that can say, okay, I'm going to stop for a day or two. Okay, if I'm going to stop for a day or two, when I return, am I returning to that previous limit, right? So am I having one drink of wine at the end of the day? Is it impacting my ability to interact with my family? Or am I having 2 or 3 drinks with the family and then spending the rest of my night drinking to the point where I'm not going to sleep, but I'm really passing out, and now I'm waking up the next day and I have to have that substance in order to even start my day, in order to even feel like I'm okay? Because there's a physical aspect that happens as well. So if I have to have it in order to physically get started, then that's part of that addiction cycle as well.
And I know, in addition to, questioning if they really are able to get off of it or not, I think that sometimes something people miss on the journey to addiction is realizing that they're constantly chasing that first high that happened. Can you speak to that a little bit more?
Mm-hmm. So you're talking about like that reward circuit, right? So there's a euphoria that floods the brain, different chemicals, dopamine, things like that. And typically the individual's first experience is that high that they're trying to chase, because there's nothing that's going to ever be as good as that first time. And then their ability to use, right, changes. So maybe I started off having 1 or 2 drinks at the end of the day, and now that 1 or 2 drinks turns into 6, right? So my tolerance has now changed. And all of these things, we have to look at it. There are cells that start to change within our brain chemistry, within our body. And the tolerance is another aspect that a person can look out for in terms of where the addiction starts to creep in.
And so as you do it over time, your tolerance level increases. So then you're able to do more and more because you're not getting that same rush, that same high.
And that's with any addiction. So, we talk about substance abuse, of course, but there's also other types of addiction, whether we're talking about food, right? We're talking about, as I mentioned, cigarettes earlier, sex addiction. They all have their respective lanes. However, just keeping in mind that tolerance does change. So starting off, chasing the high, having that experience that when either it was fun at the beginning and now there's a requirement. I am now craving that in order to function. It's something that I have to do in order to be able to move through my day-to-day life.
So really, basically, when that stops, when you're still chasing that high, when you are having such an impact on your day-to-day life that you're not functioning as normal, that's when you're sort of getting into that danger zone of addiction. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned there are different types of addictions. What are some of those?
So looking at, like I mentioned, like food addiction, right? So there's food addiction, sex and love addiction. The one we focus on a lot is really the substance abuse, right? Because we can categorize and break down substances. And that's the one we typically see and talk about a lot more, because there's a environmental response that we have to it. Whether it's the war on drugs, there's a response to it. Whereas if it's something to do, let's say food addiction, you look at a person and there's all these different thought processes or stigmas attached, right? That person's overweight for this reason. They just have to, stop overeating. Whereas it may not be that they're overeating, right? So there's different aspects of it, whether it's, the anorexia, bulimia, things like that. All things that are focused on, but really with that stigma. Whereas when we talk about drugs, we're able to break it down into different categories, whether it's biological, environmental, social. There's a start to it. And until it starts to impact one's life in a more negative way, that is typically when individuals can say, you have a problem. And a lot of times it's not the person with the issue that is saying it right away. It's usually someone close to them that recognizes a change in that person. And it even affects them emotionally, right? So if I go without the substance for a period of time, like you mentioned, a day or two, let's look at how I'm responding to you now. Am I snappy, right? Am I agitated? Am I more anxious? How is my response? How is my behavior on the day-to-day compared to someone that maybe doesn't have an addiction? So those are some things as well to look out for.
And you mentioned that usually the first signs are pointed out not by the individual, but by someone in their life. So what are some signs that we can look for people in our lives as far as saying like, okay, they might have a problem?
So it's really difficult, but one of the things we look out for is really what changes are you seeing? Is this person making informed decisions? Are they capable of that, right? Are they being more reckless? Are they drinking and driving? Are they endangering not only themselves, but loved ones? What does that now look like? Are they missing important family or social events that typically they would have attended? Are there depressive symptoms that may be recognized as well? Because it is not always the person that you see laughing and drinking. It's the person that isolates, the person that's not showing up for events and not being present as they used to be before.
And so let's say you notice those signs, some of the things we've talked about. That is such a touchy subject approaching anyone. I mean, we've all seen like the show Intervention, and we've seen like different things, but what is the best way to approach somebody?
And it's going to be so hard because in this conversation, there's no one way to address each person going through these struggles. So the best way is to really come at it from a place of love and support. Now, when I say love and support, sometimes people think that means holding their hand, right? And just babying someone. No, that's not what it means. It's recognizing that this individual is dealing with a chronic disease. And how would we want them to get help, whether it was anything else that you labeled them as, right? And some of that is really just talking to them about what you notice. So, you mentioned like the show Intervention. Sometimes we come at it from a group approach, and sometimes that's not the best approach. Or sometimes we go and we're maybe not the closest person to that individual. So someone else doing it may be a better approach. So it's knowing your audience and identifying how would they respond. Now, don't get me wrong, you're not going to know their response because they're not thinking in a clear perspective, right? Let's say their logical mind may not be as active as it typically was to make informed decisions. So it can be anything as just talking about your concerns, to pointing out what you notice, to letting them know that you love and care about them and what you're seeing is concerning, pinpointing what the behaviors and the changes look like from your perspective and how can you then support them. And maybe also doing some research, because I find that research and education are key as well. So the individual may not even notice these changes themselves. And by you doing some research, you can then talk to them about that as well.
Absolutely. Now, when we think about addiction, I think a phrase that we hear is like addictive personality. Is that a thing? Like, are there some people who are naturally predispositioned to being addicted, or is it something that really anybody, if given enough of contact with any substance, can become addicted?
So when we talk about like addictive personality, and let's take substances off the table for a moment, that can be really anything. It's the person's ability to overdo something where it could potentially be harmful to them, right? So going to the gym. And maybe you hurt yourself, but yet you still have that drive and desire to be in the gym, to still work out. Being sick, maybe, healing from a surgery, having a twisted ankle or something like that. But yet you will not feel as though you are emotionally well unless you still go and have that workout. Once again, we're talking about like releases of endorphins that we get when we do work out, right? So that addictive behavior, that addictive personality can come from a lot of things. Shopping, right? Shopping's another big one. So the person that is not just, I need another pair of shoes. See, right? So I need another pair of shoes. Well, okay, now is it that I really need that shoe?
It's like I need them in every color though, because what if I have to wear it in a different outfit? Yeah.
Exactly. And then when do you stop? Like, when does that stop? Well, I didn't pay my bills yet, but yet I'm going to go buy these shoes. right? So we have to look at what is it taken away from. I'm not here, getting groceries for the family, but yeah, I have money and time to go and buy this pair of shoes or this purse. I have the time that I'm dedicating to something else. So it's really any compulsive behavior that you're doing in excess.
Mm. Now, May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and we're always talking about mental health anyways. But a question I do have is, do those of us who live with mental illness, like I live with major depression and anxiety, does it increase the chances of becoming addicted?
So you did touch on this a moment ago. So when we think about our environment, right? So our environment changes and that impacts us as well. So we are predisposed. So let's say you have a family member that was addicted to a substance. Doesn't mean that you are definitely going to have an addictive personality or be addicted to that substance. It means that there's a likelihood that you could be, right? Just like with mental health. So if someone in your family has a mental illness, there's a likelihood that you could have a mental illness yourself, but it doesn't mean definitely. So we're products of our environment, our biology. These are all factors that impact us on a regular basis. And unfortunately, we've seen consequences of some of those things when they go unchecked. And really, it's about the awareness of making sure that the person who is dealing with anxiety understands what those symptoms look like. Because putting a label on it doesn't always help. Understanding what it looks like and feels like is really important, and understanding where then to get help and support is key.
Absolutely. With those of us who live with mental illness, I know that you mentioned, your environment impacts it. Do you think that, because something I hear frequently, right? Anyone who's talked about mental health knows the medication conversation. Should we be on it? Should we not be on it? Is it okay? Is it not okay? And I do think that sometimes people will try to self-medicate instead of like, I don't want to be on, Prozac or Xanax, but I'll do weed every day. Realizing that that's still a same form of needing something to help you bypass. But is there, I guess, a danger in that, separate from saying like, oh, weed is bad? But I mean, if we're talking about doing a prescription drug versus a natural herb, like, where does that all kind of fit in the world of thinking about addiction and mental health and medication?
It's a tricky line, because when we talk about behavioral health issues, right? So whether it's the addiction, the mental health, one can lead to the other. And typically we see, dual diagnosis, co-occurring, the terms change depending on what circle you're in. So what that looks like is, if I am struggling with anxiety, so when we talk about like social anxiety, individuals that really have a hard time going out into public, individuals that have a hard time with a party, social events, and it doesn't have to be something so elaborate, but I'm just going to use like a party, right? So graduation party may be something coming up recently for a few people. So the person that you want there, but their anxiety gets high, that person may recognize, well, when I drink, my anxiety may not be as impacted, because maybe I'm out of my head. Maybe I'm not thinking as much about what this environment feels like and looks like right now. So once I get that experience and I realize, hey, alcohol is a great way for me to deal with this, now I'm self-medicated. Right? Now I recognize this helps me. But there's a pitfall with that. So how much is going to be enough in those social experiences, right? Whereas if you're prescribed the medication, can you be over or under prescribed? Yes. And that's the other part. So unfortunately, it becomes trial and error, where you may be prescribed medication for your anxiety and you find that it's working. But you have an experience that maybe your anxiety increases because of a change in your life, whether it's divorce, a breakup, whatever the case may look like, some type of experience now changes and your anxiety goes up. So guess what? But if my medication works and this is the dosage I'm prescribed, well, maybe I can take 2 and that now helps. That's not what's prescribed. So medication can help. Usually we communicate with our doctors to let them know this, when I took it this way, this worked. and it will be prescribed appropriately. However, we have to also be cautious. If we're experiencing something out of our norm, something that doesn't feel good, it's important to mention those symptoms, potential side effects to the doctor as well, so they can adjust the medication appropriately.
Now, when we think about sort of like that self-medication that people do, and the drugs and the alcohol usually to get out of their head and to have fun, a lot of that starts young, which also mental illness showed signs of itself around the same age also. So like, how does one really combat that and also address it with teens? Like, this is actually the worst time for you to start playing with those drugs.
Communication is important, open communication and dialogue. I find that a lot of times parents, society, individual, your environment, community, try to shield individuals, especially teenagers and kids and adolescents, from what they are experiencing. Things are different now, especially thinking like when I went to school, things are a lot different. Kids are experiencing bullying, cutting, a lot of things at a younger age. And parents sometimes think, or I'll say community, right? Because it's not just the parents, community. So the community may think by not bringing it up, they're shielding the kids from it. But by not bringing it up, you're not providing a level of support, a safe space for them to come to and talk about it. Prevention doesn't happen when you have a blind eye. Part of that prevention is the communication. I was one of those kids. You tell me about what the danger looks like, and I was not curious enough to go and want to engage in it. But some people are. And if they do engage, like, don't get me wrong, there are some things I would engage in, right? So I'll climb a tree. You may have told me not to climb the tree, but I'm climbing the tree. I have the bruises on my legs to prove it, right? Yeah. Next thing I know, I'm falling from the tree. Now I have a bruise. That taught me something. But I'm not going to go and cower and hide in the corner and not show you. What I'm going to do is know that because you told me, you had a safe dialogue for me to come to. Now when I experience, I can come to you. Like, I have friends that talk to their kids about substance abuse in their family and what that looks like. So if they go out and experience something, they feel more comfortable going to their community, whether that's their mom, dad, aunt, uncle, and that's really important, because if you're not giving them that opportunity, you are now leaving them to go to their friends or to turn to someone else. And typically when that happens, it's the wrong information. Yes, it's the wrong information. So where do they feel comfortable falling? And unfortunately, that's where we see things continue to escalate.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate. Like, when you leave that space, they will fill it in with anything.
They'll find a way, and even it may not be their friends. It may be something on social media. It may be something on TV, right? So there's a lot of danger in not being that safe space for your child or the adolescent to be able to come to.
Yeah, and I'm a huge proponent of parents talking to their kids, even when they see like they don't listen. Like, there's so many things my mom told me, I was like, oh, okay. Right. But they still stuck. And then later when I was out, like, even just something as simple as like, never leave your glass unattended. Like, if you walk away, don't drink it when you stuff like that. It's so simple. I was like, okay, mom. But then I got older, and in college, I'm like, oh yeah, definitely good advice.
That is a wonderful point. So I think about things that, my parents have said to me, my loved ones have said, and it definitely sticks out. I don't go out if I don't have a full, charged battery. Oh, I'm probably going to stop or bring my charger with me and make sure I can charge it. If I have a drink somewhere, I'm definitely not leaving it unattended. If I have to leave it unattended, we're just going to get another one. Being aware of your environment, being on the lookout. If I go somewhere, I'm not having headphones in both ears, right? I may have it in one. Just little things that, like you said, stand out because that's what I was taught. But in the moment, it seems like the adolescent may not care. But there's little things you may recognize they say to their friends that, as loved ones, you look back and you're like, oh, you were listening, but they're grown into their own. So, of course, they want that independence as well.
Yeah. So sometimes it takes that growing up. I feel like by the time I entered my mid-20s, that all of a sudden I went from like, oh, mom is still not with it, to like quoting her every 5 minutes. Well, my mother told me, and my
Yes.
mother's always said.
Yes. Oh, I was
Interesting
definitely
how
that
happened.
person. Oh, I was
Yeah.
definitely that person that did that a lot. Well, my aunt said, my mom said, my uncle said, and, I appreciated that. And sometimes, parents may not realize that talking to your child, they're getting that information from you. And a lot of times opening up about their experience. When you shield the child from knowing you. So that's another big part, whether it's the mental health or addiction. If they're not sure what's going on, talking to them about what happened in the family, those are important things. So they can recognize, okay, well, things happen in our family too. It's not just, something they need to internalize. Because when you internalize it, that gives way for someone else to come in with their point of view, or even for depression or anxiety to seep in, because now I'm internalizing these things as being my fault.
Yeah, I'm a huge component of that, talking with family, because like you said, addiction or mental health things, like if you know what's been in the family tree, what's been in the family line, you don't always feel like, oh, I'm this odd person out, or I'm starting this new thing.
Exactly. And the symptoms are so important to talk about, because especially in, different communities, things look differently. So we say anxiety, depression, addiction. It looks a little different depending on the environment itself. The environment that has family members who maybe come off as angry, that could be another form of the anxiety creeping in. But because everyone labels that person as always being angry, no one takes the time to be empathetic and recognize there may be something more going on here. Same thing with the addiction. The person that seems to not care. Is it that they don't care? Or is it that they're not sure where to get help? Is it that they haven't had the opportunity to? Because not everyone knows where and how to get support when it comes to, behavioral health issues.
And you mentioned a huge word, a critical word, which is empathy, having empathy for people. And it seems to be a word, unfortunately, that's frequently missing in the addiction conversation. It's almost as though people feel like, well, you got yourself into this, you started this thing, and now it's your fault. I think there's been a little bit more compassion on the side of like opioids, because it's like, oh, it's prescribed, but there's still like that stigma around it and around other things. Like, what are some ways that people can practice a little bit more compassion or think about addiction in a way that lets them be like, okay, like, let me have some empathy for that person?
I think what happens too with the lack of empathy sometimes is you have the loved ones that feel as though they've tried, and they feel like they've tried everything, right? So maybe looking at what that looks like, maybe you weren't the right person to address it. Maybe getting another family member, another loved one involved, or maybe getting a professional to help support it, right? To support the dialogue or the conversation. So empathy really comes from this place of being able to put yourself in someone else's shoe and being able to be present and listen and really understand what this person may need in that moment. Because it's not always about getting to the end, right? Because let's be clear, when we talk about addiction and recovery, that is lifelong. That's not, oh, I got to the finish line, I'm now cured, right? So like when we talk about remission, so if someone's dealing with cancer, for example, and they get in remission, you may ask them how long they've been in remission for, right? It's celebrated. When it's the addiction, the disease of addiction, that individual has to manage their everyday life experience, every interaction, and it has to go beyond. Once that person enters treatment, it's beyond just the addiction, picking up and putting down the substance. It's where are the triggers? What was the point that caused this? And a lot of times we have adverse experiences, right? So childhood experiences that sometimes come up. And what may be traumatizing to one person is not to another. Right. So really understanding that person's viewpoint. And when they do share, because sometimes people do tell their loved ones what they need and what happened. And sometimes the loved one doesn't believe or doesn't understand, right? Your two kids grew up in the same household, have different experiences, and one of them may wonder, how is that? We have a great life. Well, from your point of view, that's what it felt and looked like. but this other individual may not have felt that way. So it's important to, look at it in terms of empathy as being in that person's experience, walking their walk.
Absolutely. And this has been such a great conversation. Thank you so much for all of your knowledge. I do have one other question that I want to end with, which is a little bit difficult. So you've recognized addiction in somebody and they're going through it and you're helping them. When do you put up your boundaries that it's enough for you? I think that's one of the hardest things I see with addiction. It's like you want to help them, but you don't want to enable them. But it's like, do you let them go to rock bottom and figure it out, or do you step in? Like how? And I know it's different for everyone.
Yes.
But what are some things that people can do to sort of figure out if it's time to draw that line?
Well, so it's interesting. I think it's always important to have boundaries. So here's what occurs. We wait until there's an issue to put boundaries up. My boundary should be in place at the beginning. Regardless of if the person has an addiction or something going on in their life, I should already have my boundaries, right? My boundaries should be pretty clear to those around me. If my boundaries were not clear and I have someone who's struggling with addiction and I am now trying to figure out how to navigate and support them, right? Let's say the person lives with me. At this point, they've stolen things from me. They come in late, stuff like that. Well, I think the boundary should have been in place before then, right? What is my expectation for me in this situation? And understanding that they may have struggled beyond my ability to help support them, okay? So is my expectation that they now go to treatment? Have I said that up front, right? Because we do have to look at it in terms of where's my part? Where's my accountability? And I have an accountability if I never set the boundary. Like sometimes we want to sugarcoat things and we want to make it seem as though it's everybody else's fault sometimes. But if my boundaries weren't clear, whose fault is that really? Yeah. So I don't think it should be something that you wait for. I don't think it's only the individual is going to know what their boundaries look like. But also, I don't think a person has to hit rock bottom. And rock bottom looks different for different people. Right? Sometimes you think about somebody losing everything. It doesn't always look that way. It can look very simple as someone thinking about doing something and, recognizing, oh my gosh, this could have been really bad decision in my life. And that may have been enough for that person. That may have been their rock bottom. Rock bottom doesn't have to be pulling the rug out from under them. It can be as simple as, if you don't adhere to my boundary, I will not be able to support you. And list the ways you can't support them, right? If it's financial, be clear about that and sticking to it. If it's emotional, being clear about that and recognizing I can be here for you when these things happen and making those requirements very clear.
I think that is excellent advice. All of this has been so great information, both from the person who may be living with it or just in their life. Yes. And I know that you mentioned that sometimes people just don't know the resources that are available. What are some of those resources? And I'll include them in the comment section as well. I mean, in the caption as well.
So some of the resources really, it's hard to navigate some of it sometimes. So, we have resources in Delaware that are really essential for an individual. So it's not always the person needing to go to treatment, right? So there's a hope line that's able to be accessed. And I'll make sure I send you these resources as well. There's a bridge clinic. All these services are free. There's DE-BEST. And once you click on the website, it helps you navigate and it gives you like little blurbs that you can figure out what is it that I may want. And some of it's just picking up the phone and asking a question, which we know can be one of the hardest things to do, right? There's also a hope line that Delaware has, and it's interacting and talking to someone that may have been down the same path that you believe you're going down. And it could be family members that call. It's not just the person struggling with these areas. And something that I wanted to touch on too, not because you're not the one struggling with the addiction or the diagnosis of a mental illness, doesn't mean that you can't benefit from support as well, right? Sometimes the support system needs just as much support as the person going through it. That's why when it comes to NA and AA meetings, those are great supports for the individuals, but we also have things like Al-Anon, right? So you have supports for the family as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, thank you so much for taking up your time. We're recording this on a Saturday afternoon, so I appreciate you giving up some of your weekend for me.
Of course, no problem.
And before we go, was there anything else that we didn't cover? Any last messages on the topic of addiction that you'd like to share?
I think just conversations. You know, we went through a period, and I think we may still be in that moment where we talk about cancel culture. It's important to address the topics head on and have open forums and open dialogues. And it's great. I think the best conversations I have is when I'm in a room with individuals who don't have the same viewpoint and we agree to disagree and we leave having a different perspective on something. Doesn't mean that, you know, we're here to change each other's minds, but just the fact that we can be open and receptive. And I think a lot of times we move away and shift from that. And that's not really the best way to be able to have informed conversations and to be a more inclusive environment and community. So.
Yeah. Yep, I agree. Well, thank you again for joining me. And as I mentioned, I'll include information in the caption section. Thank you all of those who have joined and watched. If you've missed previous videos, we have a whole series of Sharing Hope community conversations. Those are sometimes recorded. We didn't record this last one because of the sensitive topic, but that's why we're doing this. But we also have a series of conversations that I've had with other community leaders on the topic of mental health. So please check those out when you get a chance. Visit NAMIDelaware.org to find out more resources and also how you can get involved. Thank you, and you have a great day.
Thank you.